I am Marcus Whitfield, 67 years old, and I built everything I own with these two hands, so my daughter would never have to know what it feels like to go without. I poured $750,000 of my retirement and my late wife's life insurance into her dream restaurant on the riverfront. When I finally called her husband to ask what time the grand opening started, he laughed at me. He told me it had already happened 2 weeks ago. He said my factory floor energy didn't belong around their investors. 4 days later, he called back, frantic, because the liquor distributor was threatening to pull every bottle off the shelves unless the rest of the money came through. He wanted to know if I'd wired it yet. I just listened to him breathe for a second, and then I told him I don't bankroll men I wouldn't trust to watch my dog. Before I walk you through exactly how I legally took that entire building out from under them, tell me in the comments, where are my brothers and sisters watching from tonight? Hit subscribe if you believe a closed mouth and a quiet plan beats a loud mouth every single time. My workbench sits in the garage behind my house, same one I built the year my daughter Renata was born, 38 years ago now. The wood is stained dark with motor oil and sawdust, and 38 years of fixing other people's problems for a living. I spent 4 decades as a master electrician, the kind of man who got called at 3 in the morning when a hospital's backup generator failed or a school's wiring caught fire. I never made the kind of money men make sitting behind desks. I made the kind of money men make climbing into crawl spaces nobody else wanted to enter. On a gray Wednesday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a single piece of paper in front of me, a wire transfer confirmation. $750,000, gone from my account into an LLC with my daughter's name attached to it. I had liquidated nearly everything. My pension cushion, my late wife Carol's insurance payout, even sold a rental property I'd owned since 1994. Renata had spent 6 years working her way up in restaurant management, learning the business from the inside, and she finally had her shot, a real sit-down place on the water, white tablecloths, the kind of restaurant where she'd be the boss, instead of somebody's assistant manager. I was proud in a way that made my chest hurt a little. I'd spent my whole life with grease under my fingernails, so my daughter could one day wear a blazer and shake hands with a maitre d'. The opening was supposed to be that weekend. I'd had my one good suit pressed and hanging on the back of my closet door for a month. I picked up my phone and called the restaurant's office line, just wanting to know what time to show up and watch my daughter cut that ribbon. Her husband Desmond answered. Desmond had married into my family 3 years ago, a smooth-talking man who'd gone to business school and never once, in 3 years, asked me a single question about my life before I had money to give. He always spoke to me like he was doing me a favor by remembering my name. I asked him warmly, like a father should, what time the opening was and where I should park. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the line. When he finally spoke, his voice had that oily, condescending tone men like him use when they think they've already won something. He told me the opening had already happened, 2 weeks prior. I sat very still in my chair. I asked him to repeat that, certain I'd misheard him. He didn't apologize. He doubled down. He explained, slow and patient like I was a child, that the guest list had been curated investors, food bloggers, a few minor local celebrities, people who understood the brand. He said that having a man who smelled like a hardware store standing in the dining room would have confused the narrative they were building. He actually used those words. Confused the narrative. He told me my flannel and my work boots weren't the look they wanted associated with a restaurant charging $40 for a plate of pasta. He said it would have embarrassed Renata in front of the people who mattered. He rambled for nearly 5 minutes about brand positioning and influencer partnerships and how hard it had been to get a particular food critic to attend. He never once mentioned the $750,000 that had paid for the kitchen equipment under his feet. To Desmond, that money wasn't a sacrifice. It was an entry fee, something owed to him simply for being smart enough to marry well. He ended the call by telling me we could grab a bite sometime, once things settled down, like he was tossing a bone to a stray dog. Then the line went dead. I set the phone down on the table, gently. I did not throw it. I did not raise my voice into an empty kitchen. Tears and shouting are for men who don't have a plan. I sat in silence and let the truth settle over me like cold water. The daughter I had raised alone after Carol passed, the daughter I had worked double shifts to put through culinary management school, had let her husband decide I wasn't worth the dignity of an invitation. I stood up slowly, my knees aching the way they always do, the price of 4 decades spent kneeling in attics and crawl spaces. I walked down the hall to the small office I keep, the room that still smells like Carol's old perfume and stacks of paperwork. I opened the fireproof lockbox, bolted into the closet floor, and pulled out a thick manila folder. It wasn't sentimental, it was contracts. Desmond and Renata believed I had simply handed them $750,000 as a gift, a foolish old man emptying his savings out of love. They had no idea I'd used that money to purchase the building itself through a property holding company I'd quietly formed, Whitfield Standing LLC, and that every piece of kitchen equipment, the imported ovens, the walk-in coolers, the custom bar had been bought and leased back through a second entity in my name alone. I closed the folder, set it on my desk, and waited. Exactly 4 days later, my phone rang. Desmond's name on the screen. I let it ring 3 times. Gone was the smooth, condescending businessman. In his place was a man whose voice cracked with panic. He didn't bother with hello. He demanded to know why the secondary funds hadn't cleared. He said the liquor distributor was hours from pulling every bottle of wine and spirits off the shelves, that the linen company was threatening to repossess the tablecloths, that they had a packed dining room booked for Friday night, and no way to serve a single drink. He had banned me from the most important day of his wife's career, and now he expected me to quietly bail out the consequences of his arrogance. I let him talk until his voice gave out. Then I spoke, calm and even, my voice cooling the air between us. I told him he'd been right about one thing: my factory floor energy really didn't belong in his restaurant. I told him my bank account didn't belong there either. I told him I don't fund strangers, and I definitely don't fund tenants who disrespect their landlord, he stammered, confused by that last word. But I had already hung up and blocked his number. I walked back to my office, picked up the folder, and called Yvonne Carter, the sharpest real estate attorney I'd worked with on commercial jobs for 20 years. It was time to remind everybody whose name was actually on the deed. It took less than an hour for Desmond's leased BMW to come tearing up my driveway, paper spraying against my porch steps. He didn't knock. He shoved through my front door like he owned it, his face flushed red, his expensive shirt untucked for the first time I'd ever seen him look anything less than polished. He didn't ask how I was. He started pacing my living room, demanding to know what kind of game I was playing, accusing me of sabotaging his wife's restaurant out of jealousy because I hadn't gotten a VIP seat at the opening. He told me the $750,000 had only ever been seed capital, that I was obligated to keep funding the place until it turned a profit. He looked around my modest living room at the same furniture I'd had since the 90s and sneered, asking what exactly I was saving money for, living like this. He said a man who spent his whole life as an electrician had no business questioning how real entrepreneurs ran a business. I sat in my recliner and let him finish. Then I asked him if he remembered the year Renata started culinary school, when I worked 3 16-hour days a week, rewiring an entire hospital wing in July heat so thick it felt like breathing through a wet towel. I asked if he remembered that I never let her take out a single student loan. He rolled his eyes and told me he didn't have time for nostalgia, that his business was collapsing and he needed capital, not a history lesson. I told him this wasn't nostalgia. This was an audit. I reached down, picked up the folder from my coffee table, and slid the property deed across the table until it touched his knee. I told him to read the name at the top. He snatched it up, scanning it fast, his brow furrowing over the words Whitfield Standing LLC. I explained, slow and steady, that the $750,000 had never been a gift deposited into their account. I had used it to purchase the building outright. I told him he didn't own the dining room, the kitchen, the floors, or the bar. He was a tenant. His lease existed entirely at my discretion. The color drained out of his face. He tried to recover, stammering that even if I owned the building, the restaurant itself, the equipment, the license was still theirs. I pulled the second set of documents from the folder and slid those across too. The equipment lease. Every oven, every walk-in cooler, every piece of custom millwork in that dining room leased back to them monthly through a separate holding company. I told him if I terminated that lease, he'd be left standing in an empty room with nothing but a liquor license and a logo. He dropped the papers on the table, hands shaking. I leaned forward and told him the truth as plainly as I could. He owned a name on a sign and a stack of 5-star reviews. Everything that actually generated income belonged to me. I reminded him of his own words, that I didn't belong in that dining room. I told him he was right. I didn't belong there as a guest. I belonged there as the man who owned the ground beneath his feet. He stood up, smoothed his shirt, and laughed in my face, telling me I was a relic, that real businessmen didn't operate out of a toolbox. He vowed to walk into a bank the next morning, get a loan, using the kitchen equipment as collateral, and pay off my entire stake just to be done with me forever. I told him that sounded like a fine plan. He stormed out, and I picked up the phone and called Yvonne. I told her the bait had been taken, and to make sure every lien we'd filed against that equipment was airtight and on public record. The next morning, Desmond and Renata walked into the lobby of First Coastal Commercial Bank, dressed like they were attending an awards show. My daughter wore a blazer I didn't recognize, her hair done up, sunglasses pushed onto her head like a crown. They requested a private meeting with the senior loan officer, a careful woman named Patricia Owusu, who'd built her career not being impressed by anybody's shoes. For 20 minutes, Desmond talked about brand value, about the food blog feature, about the local news segment that had called the restaurant the riverfront's best-kept secret. Renata talked about their social media following, about the investors circling. Patricia took notes and waited for the part that mattered. When she finally asked about collateral, Desmond slid across a glossy equipment list, the imported ovens, the walk-ins, the custom bar, and offered it all up as security for $1 million line of credit. Confident, smug, certain this was his winning move. Patricia excused herself for 25 minutes. When she came back, the warmth was gone from her face. She sat down, opened a folder of her own, and told them flatly that the loan was denied. Desmond demanded to know why, his voice climbing. Patricia slid county filings across the desk and explained, with surgical patience, that every single piece of equipment on his list was already encumbered by a registered lien held by Whitfield Standing LLC. She explained that none of it belonged to his restaurant. He was, in the bank's eyes, a renter offering up someone else's property as collateral, which, she added, bordered on bank fraud. Renata went pale. Desmond's mouth opened and closed, with nothing coming out. They were escorted out of that office and through the lobby in complete silence, the illusion of their success shattered in front of the staff. That night, Renata called me. Not Desmond Renata. Her voice was different than it had been in years, smaller, more like the girl I remembered. She asked me how I could do this to my own daughter, how I could let her find out this way, in front of strangers, that her father had quietly owned everything beneath her the whole time. I told her the truth, gently, but without backing down. I told her I never stopped believing in her. I believed in her so much, I made sure nobody, not a husband, not a bad year, not anybody's arrogance could ever take away the thing I'd built for her. I told her the building was never going anywhere. It was hers the moment she was ready to run it the right way, without a man telling her that her own father didn't belong in the room. She went quiet on the line for a long time. Then she asked me what I meant by the right way. 2 nights later, my security feed quietly installed in that building the same week I bought it. Because 40 years in construction teaches you to trust nobody's promises, picked up movement at the loading dock at 11 at night. Desmond, alone, in jeans and a baseball cap, meeting a panel van around back. He'd called a liquidator, a man who specialized in moving restaurant equipment with no paperwork and no questions, offering to sell 3 of the imported ovens for a fraction of their worth just to get cash in his hands before the whole thing collapsed around him. He didn't know the rear loading sensors fed straight to my phone. He didn't know I'd revoked his access code the moment Yvonne filed the default notice. I watched him pound on a door that would never open for him again, watched the liquidator's crew get tired of waiting and pull away, watched him stand alone in the dark outside a building he'd never actually owned, soaked through with rain and rage, with absolutely nowhere left to turn. I let the legal default run its course. 48 hours after the bank denial, with the vendor bills still unpaid and a felony attempt at moving leased property hanging over Desmond's head, I drove my truck downtown with Yvonne and a crew of 6 men in work uniforms. I didn't pull around to the service entrance. I parked my truck right out front in a spot marked for valet. I walked through the restaurant's heavy glass doors in the same boots I'd worn the day I poured the foundation for that very building. Mud still dried into the seams. The dining room was filling up for a Friday lunch rush. Investors, food critics, exactly the crowd Desmond had wanted to impress. A young host in a tailored vest moved to stop me, telling me deliveries went around back. I didn't slow down. I walked into the center of that dining room, and a moment later the glass doors opened behind me and my crew rolled in with pallet jacks and crowbars, dropping moving blankets across the hardwood floor. The room went silent, except for gasps and the scrape of chairs. Desmond came rushing out of the kitchen in his chef's coat, face white, demanding to know what I was doing. I told him, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that I was collecting my property. I told every single person sitting at those white tablecloths that the man standing in front of them didn't own the ovens cooking their food, didn't own the floor beneath their feet, didn't own anything in that building except a logo and a lie. My crew worked methodically, wheeling out equipment piece by piece while Desmond stood frozen, his whole curated world collapsing in real time in front of the exact people he'd built it to impress. By the following week, the consequences had grown past anything I controlled. The attempted late-night equipment removal triggered a police report, and once detectives started pulling financial records, they found Desmond had been forging Renata's signature on business loan applications for months, padding revenue numbers to attract investors who were now demanding their money back through lawyers. He was arrested on fraud charges. Their house went up for a short sale within 2 weeks once his accounts were frozen. The fancy SUV he'd leased in Renata's name got repossessed off the street in broad daylight, while neighbors watched from their porches. Renata, to her credit, came to the detectives herself once she understood the scope of what he'd done without her knowledge, cooperating fully, distancing herself from him in every legal and financial sense she could. It was raining the night Desmond showed up at my door, alone this time, out on bail, wearing a borrowed coat 2 sizes too big. He didn't look like the man who'd stood in my living room, calling my life's work a personal failure. He looked hollow. He dropped to his knees on my porch and begged me to help pay for a real attorney, swore he'd pay back every dollar, swore he never meant for any of it to happen the way it did. I stood in my doorway and looked down at him for a long moment. I told him I remembered every word he'd said about my flannel shirt and my work boots not belonging in his restaurant. I told him he was right about that. I never belonged in his world, built on borrowed money and forged signatures. I told him my brand, the only one I've ever needed, is accountability, and that I would not spend 1 cent of 40 years' worth of crawlspace sweat keeping him out of consequences he built with his own 2 hands. I closed the door gently, and the deadbolt clicked into place like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Renata still calls me every Sunday now. 3 months ago, she walked back into that riverfront building, this time with her name alone on the lease. This time with a business plan she built herself and a partnership with me that has actual paperwork behind it instead of blind trust. The dining room reopens next spring. My good suit is already hanging on the back of my closet door, pressed and ready, because this time I already know exactly what time the doors open. This time, nobody had to ask. Love isn't proven by how much money leaves your hands. It's proven by how wisely you protect what that money was meant to build. Marcus never stopped loving his daughter. He just refused to let someone else's pride spend it. Sometimes the deepest care looks like patience, not rescue. And when the storm passes, the people who truly belong to you always find their way back to the table. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a warm and meaningful life lesson with you.